Hello, friends, and for every day of October, I will be reading H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man. There are 28 chapters plus an epilogue, and there are some longer chapters, so we will probably break them up into multiple parts so it can last all of October. Chapter 1, The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February one wintry day, though a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking as it seemed from Bramble Bramblehurst railway station, and carrying a little black pontum, portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt had hid every inch of his face, but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coat. He staggered into the coach, the horses more dead than alive as it seemed, and flung his portmanteau down. A fire, he cried, in the name of human charity. A room and a fire. He stamped and shook the snow from off himself in the bar. He followed Mrs. Hall into her guest parlor to strike his bargain, and with that much introduction, that and a ready acquiescence to terms, and a couple of sovereigns flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and let him there while she went to prepare him a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop at Imping in the winter time was an unheard of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggler, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, and Milly, her lipstick aide, had been brisked up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions on the countertop. Contentment. She carried the plates and glasses into the parlor, and began to lay them with the utmost eclair. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat. Standing with his back to her and staring out the windows of the falling snow in the yard, his gloved hands were clasped behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melted snow that still sprinkled his shoulders dripped upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and give them a good dry in the kitchen?" "No," he said without turning. She was not sure she had heard him, but was about to repeat her question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis, and she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with side light, and he had a bushy side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his face. "Very well, sir," she said, "as you like. In a bit the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and had turned his face away from her again, and Miss Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato, and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there like a man of stone, his back unhunched, his back unhunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. She put down the egg and bacon with considerable emphasis, and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung around and approached the table. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeating at regular intervals. Chirk, chirk, chirk. It went the sound as of a spoon being rapidly whisked around a basin. "That girl," she said. "There, I clean forgot it. It's her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Millie a new verbal stabs from her excessive slowness. She had cooked the ham and eggs, laid the table, and drove everything while Millie, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him a new guest, and wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and putting it in with a certain staleness upon the gold and black tea tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped and entered prominently. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table, and then she noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire. A pair of wet boots threatened rust to her steel fender. She went to these things resolutely. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said in a voice that brooked no denial. "Leave the hat," she said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning, she saw he had raised his head and was sitting looking at her. For a moment she stood gasping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth. It was a servalty he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden. That was the reason of his muffled voice. But it was not that which startled Miss Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead above his blue glasses was covered by white bandages, and that another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, except only his pink peaked nose. It was bright pink and shiny, just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high black lined collar turned up about his neck, the thick black hair escaping as it could below and beneath the crossed bandages, projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance. Convincible, his muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated that for a moment she was rigid. He did not move the serviette, but remained holding it as she saw now, with a brown gloved hand, and regarding her with his indestructible blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking very distinctly, through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received. She placed her hat on the chair. She placed the hat on the chair by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began. And she stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing over from her to the door, and then at her again. "I'll have them nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white, sathered head and blue goggles again, and as she was going out the door. But his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was an eloquent of her surprise and perplexity. "I never," she whispered. There she went quiet softly to the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Millie what she was messing about with her now. When she got there, the visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet and glanced intriguingly at the window before he removed his uh, servility and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, then rose and taking the servantry in his hand, walked across the room and pulled the blinds down to the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in twilight. This done, he returned with an easier air to the table and his meal. The poor soul had an accident or an operation or something, said Mrs. Hall. What a turn! What a turn them bandages did give me, to be sure. She put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and extended the traveller's coat upon this. And they goggles, why he looking more like a driving helmet than a human man. She hung his muffler on the he hung his muffler on a corner of the horse, and holding that handkerchief over his mouth, all the time talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too, maybe. She turned around as one who suddenly remembers. Bless my soul alive, she said, going off at a tangent. Ain't you done them taters yet, Millie? When Miss Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must have also been cut or disfigured in the accident, she supposed him to have suffocated. The con the confirmation, for she was smoking a pipe, and all that time she was in the room. He never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped around the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece on his lips. Yet it was not forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smoldered around. He sat in the corner with each back to the window, blind, and spoke now, having eaten and drank and begun comfortably warmed through, the less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles. They had lacked Hereto. I have some luggage, he said, at Bramclers station. He asked her now he could have it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgment of her explanation. Tomorrow, he said, there is no speedier delivery, and seemed quite disappointed when she answered no. No, was she quite sure? No man with a trap who could go over. Miss Hall, nothing loath, answered his question and developed a conversation. It's a steep road by the downs, sir, she said in an answer to the question about a trap, but then snatching at an opening said, it was there a carriage was upsettled a year ago and more. A gentleman killed besides the coachman. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they? But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily. They do, he said through his muffler, eyeing her quickly through his impenetrable glasses. But they take long enough to get well, sir, don't they? There was my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a scythe, tumbled on it into the hayfield, and bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. You hardly believe it. It's regular giving me a dread of a scythe, sir. I can't quite understand that, said the visitor. He was afraid one time that he'd have to have an operation. He was that bad, sir. The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. Was he? He said. He was, sir, and no laughing matter to them, as he had the doing for him. As I had, my sister began to look up with her little ones so much. There was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo, so that if I may make no bold as to say it, sir, will you get me some matches, said the visitor quite abruptly. My pipe is out. Miss Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment, then remembered the two sovereigns she went for the matches. Thanks, he said coincidentally as she put them down and turned his shoulder upon her and stared out the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently, he was sensitive on the topic of operation and bandages. She did not make so bold as to say, however, after all, but his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time of it. That afternoon, the visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock, without giving without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part, he was quiet. Still, during the time, it would seem he had sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Or once or twice, a curious listener might have heard him at the coals and for the space of 5 minutes he was audible pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. And that's the end of chapter 1. So, friends, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Follow us on social media at Funky Play Bros and Funky Play Brothers, and please remember to help us by subscribing to our YouTube. And tune in tomorrow for chapter 2. Thank you for watching. Bye.